In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and within that endless maelstrom of violence, there exists a special kind of damnation reserved for those who have transgressed against the Imperium of man. They are the condemned, the forsaken, the irredeemable. They are the Penal legions, and they march toward death, with explosive collars around their necks and the faint hope of redemption burning in their hearts. But here's the thing that most people don't realize about the Penal legions. Some of them survive. Against all odds, against the express intent of their commanders, against the very purpose of their punishment, a handful of these condemned souls somehow beat the merciless mathematics of attrition and live to see another day. And another, and sometimes, impossibly, enough days to earn something that was never meant to be theirs. Freedom. The existence of Penal Legion survivors is a paradox that strikes at the heart of imperial justice. These men and women were not supposed to make it back. Their death was the punishment, the redemption, the whole point of the exercise. They were human munitions, expendable assets to be spent in the Emperor's name and forgotten. Yet they persist, these ghosts of a system designed to consume them utterly, and their stories reveal uncomfortable truths about the Imperium's most brutal military formation. Penal legions are not simply another regiment of the Astra Militarum. They are not brave soldiers who volunteered to defend humanity. They are criminals, cowards, heretics, and traitors who have been given one final chance to serve the god, Emperor, before their souls are judged. The official designation in Imperial High Gothic is Legions Penitenti. The Penetrating Legions, though that formal title, does little to convey the desperation and horror of their existence. They are formed from the dregs of imperial society, drawn from overcrowded prisons on penal worlds scattered across the galaxy, from military stockades where disgraced guardsmen await execution, from Arbeits detention facilities bursting with those who have violated the countless laws of the Imperium. The formation of a penal legion begins with a simple calculation. The Imperium needs bodies, warm flesh to throw into the grinding machinery of eternal war. Criminals await execution or life imprisonment, occupying space and consuming resources. Why waste a perfectly functional human being when they could die serving the Emperor instead? It's efficient. It's practical. It's the Imperium distilled to its essence. The condemned are given a choice, though calling it a choice is generous: death by firing squad or service in a Penal legion. For most, it's an easy decision. Any chance at life, no matter how slim, beats the certainty of a bolt round to the skull. What they don't realize, what they can't fully comprehend until they're shackled in the transport ship headed for the war zone, is that they've simply chosen a slower, more agonizing death. Most Penal legionnaires die in their very first battle. Not their 10th, not their 5th, their first. They are herded forward into enemy fire, driven like cattle toward fortified positions, sent to test defensive capabilities with their own fragile bodies. Hundreds die with every engagement, their blood soaking into alien soil, their screams lost in the thunder of artillery and the chatter of alien weaponry. But some don't die, against every statistical model. Against the express intentions of their commanders, a handful survive that first battle. Their weapon doesn't jam at the crucial moment. The enemy las bolt passes centimeters from their head instead of through it. They duck behind cover a half second before the grenade detonates. Luck, skill, instinct. Or perhaps the Emperor's own hand reaches down and plucks them from death's embrace. Whatever the reason, they live. And that's where the real story begins. Because a Penal legionnaire who survives one battle is statistically likely to survive another. They've learned what the others haven't yet grasped. They understand how to move through the killing field, when to advance and when to make themselves small, which orders are suicidal and which merely appear so. They become, in the parlance of the legions, hardened criminals, not in the legal sense, though most certainly are that as well, but in the military sense. They are veterans, survivors, men and women who have stared into the abyss and somehow stumbled backward before it could swallow them whole. These survivors occupy a strange space within the imperial military hierarchy. They are still criminals, still condemned, still wearing explosive collars that can detonate with a signal from their handlers. But they're also increasingly valuable assets. A Penal legionnaire who has survived 10 engagements has more practical combat experience than many officers in regular guard regiments. They know things that can't be taught in any scholar, lessons written in blood and burned into their nervous systems through sheer terror. They become the core around which new penal units are formed, the grim veterans who show fresh conscripts how to load a lasgun under fire, where to aim when the enemy is charging, how to keep moving when every instinct screams to curl into a ball and wait for death. The Imperium recognizes this value in its cold, calculating way. Hardened criminals, as these veterans are sometimes called, receive slightly better equipment, slightly more discretion in how they approach their objectives. They're still expected to die, mind you, but perhaps not quite as quickly as the fresh meat arriving with each transport. Yet the question remains, what happens to these survivors? What becomes of a person who was sentenced to death, reprieved with service, and then refused to die on schedule? The answer varies wildly depending on the specific penal legion, the commanding officers, the nature of their crimes, and sometimes pure bureaucratic chance. Some continue to serve, battle after battle, year after year, accumulating scars and trauma in equal measure. Others earn redemption through extraordinary acts of valor, their crimes forgiven and their sentences commuted. A rare few are transferred to regular guard regiments, their past scrubbed from official records, as thoroughly as the administratum's notorious inefficiency allows. And some, the rarest of all, rise to positions of leadership within the penal legions themselves, becoming officers, sergeants, even colonels of these damned formations. The truth about penal legion survivors is this: they represent the Imperium's brutal pragmatism taken to its logical extreme. They are living proof that even in a system designed to kill them, human tenacity can find purchase. They are testaments to the simple fact that sentencing someone to die and actually killing them are two very different things. Their existence raises uncomfortable questions about justice, redemption, and whether a soul can truly be cleansed through violence. But in the end, in the grim darkness of the far future, questions matter less than results, and penal legion survivors, for all their crimes and all their sins, deliver results. Teach Kramas Chakodem. To understand penal legion survivors, we must first understand how one becomes a penal legionnaire in the first place. The path to the legions is paved with transgressions, but the nature of those transgressions varies wildly across the vast expanse of the Imperium. What might earn you a medal on one world could see you executed on another, and what constitutes a minor infraction in one sector might be a capital crime in the next. The Imperium is vast beyond human comprehension, encompassing millions of worlds, each with its own laws, customs, and interpretations of imperial doctrine. This creates a bizarre situation where the populations of penal legions are incredibly diverse in terms of their actual crimes, united only by the fact that someone, somewhere, decided their transgressions warranted this particular form of punishment. The most straightforward candidates for the penal legions are military personnel who have committed crimes while in service. Guardsmen who desert their posts face a simple choice: execution by firing squad or transfer to a penal legion. Cowardice in the face of the enemy, once proven, carries the same sentence. These crimes are taken with utmost seriousness in the Astra Militarum, where discipline must be maintained at all costs, and where a single soldier's failure can cascade into a company's rout and a regiment's destruction. The punishment must be severe enough to deter others, while also extracting some final use from the condemned. Hence, the penal legions. These military criminals often make up a significant portion of penal legion ranks, and they bring with them valuable training and experience. They know how to fight, how to follow orders, how to operate within a military structure. Their crime wasn't incompetence but moral failure, a distinction that makes them potentially valuable assets if they can be motivated properly. Murder within the ranks is another common military crime leading to penal legion service. When a guardsman kills a fellow soldier, whether in a drunken brawl, a fit of rage, or cold-blooded premeditation, the consequences are severe. The case of a trooper known only as Ox, recruited into the famous 13th Penal Legion, illustrates this perfectly. Ox killed 3 off-duty officers with his bare hands during a drunken brawl. His immense strength and brutal efficiency in combat made him valuable enough to spare, but his crime could not go unpunished. The Penal Legions provided the perfect solution, a way to channel his violence toward the Emperor's enemies, while ensuring his life remained forfeit to imperial justice. Similar stories echo throughout Penal Legion ranks. Officers who abuse their authority, soldiers who turn their weapons on their own comrades, men and women whose anger or instability makes them dangerous to those around them. All find their way to the legions, where their violent tendencies can be aimed at something other than fellow Imperials. Theft and corruption represent another major category of Penal Legion crimes, particularly when they involve military assets. The Imperium's logistics are a matter of life and death, and those who steal from the Emperor's stores commit a crime against the entire war effort. Embezzlement, black marketeering, unauthorized requisition of supplies. These crimes might seem minor compared to murder or desertion, but they strike at the foundation of the imperial military machine. A character called Fingers, another member of the 13th Penal Legion, earned his place through black marketeering, trading in stolen military goods for personal profit. Similarly, a tech adept named Gudmans was condemned after being caught selling supplies from his forge world to space pirates, a crime that saw him stripped of his Mechanicus augments and sentenced to service in the Penal Legions. These criminals bring useful skills with them. Finger's ability to acquire hard, to find items, and Gudmans's technical expertise proved valuable in the field, even as their crimes kept explosive collars locked around their necks. Perhaps the most varied category of Penal Legion crimes falls under the broad heading of heresy and moral transgressions. The Imperium is a theocracy, and crimes against the state are often crimes against the god, Emperor himself. Minor heresy, the possession of forbidden texts, speaking words that question imperial doctrine, associating with suspected cultists, any of these can lead to execution or Penal Legion service, depending on the severity and the judgment of local authorities. The word minor is doing heavy lifting here. In many cases, what's classified as minor heresy would be utterly unforgivable on other worlds. The classification exists primarily to distinguish between those whose souls might yet be saved through violent redemption and those so corrupted they must be purged entirely. A soldier who questions the divinity of the Emperor might be given a chance to prove his faith in blood. A soldier who worships the dark gods gets a bolt round and an unmarked grave. Mutation presents another path to the Penal Legions, though one wrapped in tragedy and injustice. In the Imperium, mutation is a crime regardless of whether the mutant chose their condition. Genetic anarchists, mutagene carriers, and abhumans like beastmen all find themselves condemned for the simple crime of existing in a body that deviates from the human norm. On worlds with particularly strict genetic purity laws, entire populations of abhumans who might serve loyally as auxiliaries elsewhere are instead condemned to Penal Legions, their physical differences marking them as expendable in the eyes of local authorities. These mutants bring unique capabilities to the battlefield, unusual strength, enhanced senses, or simple toughness born of bodies adapted to hostile environments. They also face additional prejudice from their fellow legionnaires, condemned not just for crimes, but for the sin of being born wrong. On some worlds, the definition of what constitutes a Penal Legion crime becomes almost absurdly broad. Failure to return library books, unauthorized romantic relationships, speaking out of turn in the presence of a noble. The Imperium contains multitudes, and some of those multitudes are governed by petty tyrants who use Penal Legion service as a convenient way to dispose of political enemies or troublesome citizens. A young officer called Hero, whose real name was Green, found himself in the 13th Penal Legion for the crime of refusing a direct order to lead his men in a pointless and suicidal attack. This was his crime, valuing the lives of his soldiers over unquestioning obedience. He had been top of his class, possessed a first-class service record, and by all accounts was an outstanding officer. None of that mattered when he said no to a superior who demanded sacrifice for sacrifice's sake. His punishment stripped him of his rank and sent him to the legions, where ironically he would be ordered into the exact kind of suicidal attacks he'd refused to lead his men into previously. The variability of crimes leading to penal legion service creates a strange dynamic within the legions themselves. A soldier condemned for desertion might find himself fighting alongside someone whose crime was hacking a payroll system to increase his salary. A murderer who killed 3 men in cold blood serves next to a mutant whose only crime was being born with the wrong number of fingers. A heretic who questioned imperial doctrine shares a transport with a thief who stole from the wrong officer. This diversity of crimes creates tension, but also opportunity. The skills and backgrounds of penal legionnaires vary wildly, from trained soldiers to civilians with no military experience, from tech-savvy specialists to brutal close-quarters fighters. A clever commander can leverage this diversity, assigning legionnaires to roles that match their capabilities, rather than simply throwing them forward as an undifferentiated mass of bodies. Yet regardless of the specific crime, all penal legionnaires share one fundamental characteristic: they have been judged and found wanting by the Imperium. Their sentences are not meant to rehabilitate or reform. The penal legions are not correctional facilities. They are a mechanism for extracting final use from biological resources that would otherwise be wasted. The crimes that condemned these men and women are written on their bodies in the form of explosive collars, shaved heads bearing unit tattoos, and the knowledge that they are expected to die. Any penal legionnaire who survives their service does so not because the system is designed to permit it, but in spite of every mechanism designed to ensure their death. This makes their survival not just improbable, but almost transgressive, a violation of the sentence that was passed upon them. They were meant to die. Their continued existence represents a kind of cosmic accounting error, one that the Imperium must then decide how to correct or exploit. Liefenti Penal Legios de Aliexisci. The daily existence of a penal legionnaire is defined by 2 contradictory realities. On one hand, they are soldiers, members of the Astra Militarum, with all the routine and structure that implies. On the other hand, they are prisoners, condemned criminals whose every moment is monitored and controlled. This creates a bizarre hybrid existence: military discipline merged with penal servitude, combat readiness enforced through the threat of summary execution. To understand what it means to survive in a penal legion, we must first understand what it means to live in one. And that existence is far grimmer than most imperial citizens could imagine. The transformation into a penal legionnaire begins the moment a condemned criminal accepts service over execution. Their head is shaved, partially to prevent lice and maintain basic hygiene, but primarily to remove any sense of individual identity. The Imperium is taking away your old life, and the shaved head is the first visible sign of that erasure. Next comes the tattooing. Unit insignia is permanently marked onto the skin, usually on the forehead or scalp, ensuring that even if a penal legionnaire somehow escapes, they will be immediately identifiable. There is no hiding from service once you've been marked. The tattoos vary by unit. Some simple numerical designations, others elaborate symbols or skull imagery, all designed to mark the bearer as condemned. These tattoos become part of the legionnaire's identity, a permanent reminder of their status, even if they somehow earn redemption and return to normal society. Then comes the collar. The explosive collar locked around every penal legionnaire's neck is the physical manifestation of their sentence. These devices are sophisticated pieces of technology, small shaped charges designed to direct their blast inward, decapitating the wearer instantly, while posing minimal danger to nearby soldiers. The collars can be triggered remotely by handlers, usually commissars or adeptus mechanicus personnel attached to the unit, with ranges varying from 1 to 10 kilometers, depending on the model. Some collars detonate automatically if tampered with, or if the wearer ventures too far from their designated handler. Only the adeptus mechanicus can safely remove the collars, and they will do so only after a Legionnaire's sentence is complete, assuming they survive that long. The collar is a constant presence, a weight around the neck, both literal and psychological. Every Penal Legionnaire is acutely aware that death is quite literally hanging over them, ready to be delivered at a moment's notice if they step out of line. The collars serve multiple purposes beyond simple execution. They are disciplinary tools, psychological weapons designed to enforce absolute obedience. A handler need not waste ammunition executing a troublesome Legionnaire. A simple press of a button suffices. This creates an environment of extraordinary control where even thoughts of rebellion are dangerous. More insidiously, the collars are equipped with Frenzen dispensers in many Penal Legion units. Frenzen is the generic name for a variety of combat drugs that induce psychological states ranging from fearlessness to outright psychotic rage. Each collar typically contains 4 doses that can be administered remotely without the wearer's consent or cooperation. When battle is imminent, handlers can simply trigger the dispensers, flooding the Legionnaire's bloodstreams with chemicals that transform them into frenzied berserkers. The effect is immediate and overwhelming. Fear evaporates, pain becomes distant, self-preservation instincts are suppressed, and the only thing that matters is advancing and killing. For the Imperium, this is efficient. For the Legionnaires, it's a violation of their most basic autonomy, their very neurochemistry hijacked and weaponized. Daily life between battles varies depending on where and how the Penal Legion is deployed. When not in active combat, Legionnaires are held in secure facilities that are more prison than barracks. Aboard transport ships, they occupy sections that are essentially mobile detention centers, heavily guarded by commissariat provosts or naval ratings. On the ground, they might be held in fortified compounds, makeshift stockades, or simply chained in groups when security is tight and space is limited. The conditions are invariably harsh. Food is sufficient to maintain combat effectiveness, but little more. Bland rations designed to keep bodies functional rather than satisfied. Sleep is permitted in shifts, with guards maintaining constant vigilance against escape attempts or violence between prisoners. Exercise and training occur under close supervision, with Legionnaires drilled in basic combat techniques and unit cohesion. The goal is not to make them excellent soldiers, but to make them minimally competent and obedient enough to follow orders when driven into battle. The command structure of Penal Legions is uniquely brutal even by Imperial standards. Commissars play an outsized role. Their traditional duties of enforcing discipline and executing the cowardly magnified within units, where every soldier is already condemned. A commissar assigned to a Penal Legion holds absolute power of life and death, with explosive collars providing an efficient means of enforcement that doesn't even require them to draw their bolt pistols. These commissars tend to be particularly hard men and women, individuals who view their assignment as either punishment for their own failures or opportunity to demonstrate their zeal. They see Penal Legionnaires as irredeemable filth, barely worthy of the ammunition expended on their behalf, and they treat them accordingly. In some Penal Legion units, particularly those drawn from specific Penal worlds like Savla, additional authority figures called mercies fulfill roles similar to commissars. These provost wardens dress in black flak coats, peaked caps, and knee-high boots reminiscent of commissar uniforms, and they carry bolt pistols, as befits their status as regimental officers. Mercies are empowered to dispense summary judgment and execution, but they also serve administrative functions, collecting identification tags from the fallen and maintaining records of who has served and who has died. They exist outside the normal chain of command. Addressed as Sir by all other officers up to, and including the regiment's colonel, yet they answer directly to the regimental commissar. This creates a complex hierarchy of overlapping authority, all designed to ensure that no Penal Legionnaire can find refuge in bureaucratic confusion or gaps in supervision. The actual officers commanding Penal Legion units present another fascinating element of their structure. In standard Penal Legion formations, officers are usually not drawn from the criminal ranks. Instead, they are graduates of Schola Progenium facilities, orphans raised in the imperial cult and trained for military service from childhood. These officers view their assignment to Penal legions with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some seeing it as punishment for their own failures, others as opportunity to prove themselves in the most challenging environment imaginable. They command men and women who may be more experienced in combat, but who lack the moral authority to lead. This creates tension, with officers relying heavily on commissars and mercies to maintain discipline, while simultaneously trying to extract combat effectiveness from troops who have every reason to hate them. Within this grim hierarchy, certain Penal legionnaires may rise to positions of limited authority. Sergeants are sometimes selected from veteran legionnaires, men and women who have survived enough battles to understand tactics and who possess enough respect or fear from their fellow criminals to maintain order. These criminal sergeants walk a fine line, trying to keep their comrades alive, while also satisfying the officers and commissars who can execute them at a moment's notice. They become intermediaries, translating the often suicidal orders from above into approaches that might actually succeed without resulting in total annihilation. A skilled Penal Legion sergeant can mean the difference between a unit that fights effectively and one that simply charges forward to die. Yet these sergeants remain criminals, their authority provisional and their collars just as tight as those of the men they lead. The relationships between Penal legionnaires themselves are complex and often dark. These are not brothers in arms who volunteered to fight together. These are criminals, many of whom were violent or unstable even before their service. Trust is hard to come by when your comrades include murderers, heretics, thieves, and cowards. Yet bonds do form, born of shared suffering and the simple human need for connection even in the bleakest circumstances. A legionnaire who shares his rations when someone else is sick, who covers someone's sector during watch, who pulls a wounded comrade from the killing field. These small acts of decency create threads of humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. Veteran legionnaires sometimes form tight groups, looking out for each other through battle after battle, becoming almost like squads within the larger unit. These informal networks can be crucial for survival, providing support systems that the official structure never intended. Yet violence between legionnaires is also common. Old grudges, personality conflicts, simple proximity stress, all can explode into confrontation. Officers and commissars handle such incidents with brutal efficiency, usually by executing one or both parties. The message is clear. Your violence belongs to the Emperor, directed at his enemies, and nowhere else. Any energy spent fighting each other is wasted. Some units resort to decimation when discipline breaks down entirely, lining up the legionnaires and executing every 10th man, regardless of individual guilt. It's a technique borrowed from ancient Terran military tradition, collective punishment designed to make entire units responsible for the behavior of each individual. The psychological impact is devastating, creating an environment where legionnaires police each other more effectively than any commissar could, knowing that one person's failure might lead to their own execution. The daily routine between battles is mind-numbing. Wake, eat, drill, maintain equipment, drill again, eat, sleep, repeat endlessly. The Imperium doesn't waste time trying to rehabilitate or reform Penal legionnaires. The daily grind serves only to keep them combat, ready and too exhausted to cause trouble. Some units are forced to perform manual labor when not fighting, digging trenches, loading munitions, constructing fortifications. The work is backbreaking and pointless beyond its utility for the war effort. It keeps hands busy and minds occupied. In the grim calculus of Penal Legion management, a tired legionnaire is a compliant one. Yet within this oppressive existence, small rebellions occur. A legionnaire might hide a small personal item, a photo, a letter, a religious token, something forbidden but precious. Trading occurs despite regulations with cigarettes, ration supplements, or stolen items forming an underground economy. Gambling provides brief distraction, with men and women betting on anything from card games to which legionnaire will die first in the next battle. Dark humor thrives. Jokes about death and damnation and the absurdity of their situation. these small acts of humanity, pointless and forbidden and dangerous, represent the stubborn persistence of individual, will even in a system designed to crush it utterly. And for those who survive long enough, who manage to navigate the daily horror of Penal Legion existence through multiple deployments, these small rebellions become a form of resistance against the death sentence hanging over them, a way of saying that they are still human, still more than just expendable munitions in the Emperor's endless war. EQIPM untold, WH40K the equipment provided to Penal Legions tells you everything you need to know about how the Imperium values their lives. While regular guard regiments receive standardized gear, maintained by careful logistical chains, Penal Legionnaires make do with whatever is cheapest, oldest, or most readily available. They are not meant to survive long enough for equipment maintenance to matter, so why waste resources on quality weapons and armor? This creates a situation where survival often depends as much on a Legionnaire's ability to scavenge, steal, or improvise as on any gear officially issued to them. Yet within these limitations, patterns emerge that tell us something about how the Imperium attempts to extract maximum utility from its condemned soldiers. The standard weapon for most Penal Legionnaires is the lascarbine, a compact version of the ubiquitous lasgun that has armed Imperial forces for millennia. The lascarbine shares the lasgun's basic operating principle, a laser weapon powered by charge packs, reliable and effective against most targets. However, the carbine configuration makes several compromises. The barrel is shorter, reducing effective range. The stock is often collapsible or absent entirely, making long-range accuracy more difficult. The power pack is smaller, providing fewer shots before requiring replacement. These limitations make the lascarbine inferior to a standard lasgun in most combat situations, but they also make it cheaper to produce and easier to transport in bulk. For Penal Legions expected to fight at close range, often in urban or tunnel environments, where long-range engagements are rare, the lascarbine is considered sufficient. The weapon's reduced range is actually seen as a feature rather than a bug, encouraging Legionnaires to close with the enemy rather than hanging back and taking careful shots from cover. Ammunition for las weapons comes in the form of charge packs, powerful capacitor batteries that store the energy needed to produce laser bolts. Penal Legionnaires are typically issued 4 charge packs, enough for sustained firefights, but not the generous supply provided to regular guard units. The logic is brutal and simple. If a Penal Legionnaire survives long enough to exhaust 4 charge packs, they can scavenge more from fallen comrades or enemies. If they don't survive that long, which is statistically likely, there's no point having weighted them down with additional ammunition. In practice, this means Legionnaires must be more conservative with their shots than regular guardsmen, aiming carefully and avoiding suppressive fire that wastes charge. It also means they need to be opportunistic, grabbing charge packs from the dead whenever possible, creating a grim battlefield ritual where advancing Legionnaires loot their fallen comrades, even as fighting continues around them. Beyond the lascarbine and charge packs, standard Penal Legion equipment is sparse. Each Legionnaire receives a combat knife, doubling as both tool and weapon of last resort. The knife is usually a simple blade, unadorned and functional, but it becomes crucially important in close quarters fighting where weapons are useless. Bayonets are sometimes issued, allowing the lascarbine to be used as an improvised spear, though the carbine's compact size makes this less effective than with a full-length lasgun. Grenades are rare in Penal Legion service, typically limited to frag grenades for anti-personnel work. The Imperium is understandably cautious about giving explosives to convicted criminals, and most Penal Legion formations receive grenades only immediately before specific assaults where they're deemed necessary. The 13th Penal Legion, an elite formation we'll discuss later, is an exception, with members carrying crack grenades for anti-armor work, but this reflects their special status rather than standard practice. Armor for Penal Legionnaires consists of basic flak vests and helmets, the lowest tier of protection available in the Imperial arsenal. Flak armor is manufactured from layers of ablative and impact, absorbent materials, designed to deflect shrapnel and small arms fire. It's better than nothing, but not by much. A direct hit from a bolter, plasma weapon, or heavy stubber will punch through flak armor with ease. Even massed lasgun fire can overwhelm it. The armor's primary value is protection against shrapnel and glancing hits, the kind of wounds that might disable a soldier rather than kill them outright. For Penal legionnaires, this represents a calculated compromise. The Imperium wants them to survive long enough to reach the enemy and engage, but not to survive so easily that they become difficult to dispose of when necessary. Flak armor achieves this balance, keeping legionnaires alive through the advance, while ensuring that sustained combat will result in acceptable attrition rates. The standard equipment loadout is deliberately minimal, but it's supplemented by a few additional items considered essential for any soldier. An entrenching tool allows legionnaires to dig hasty fighting positions, though in practice they rarely survive long enough in one location to make extensive fortifications worthwhile. A basic physic kit, essentially a light medical kit, contains bandages, antiseptic, and painkillers for field treatment of wounds. Helmet Vox receivers allow legionnaires to receive orders, though notably they cannot transmit, preventing coordination of escape attempts or coordination against their handlers. This one-way communication system is another small indicator of the Imperium's paranoia regarding these condemned soldiers. They need to be able to receive orders, but they don't need to be able to talk to each other through secured channels. The equipment situation changes dramatically for certain specialized Penal Legion formations, particularly the Savlar Chem dogs. These units, drawn from the toxic Penal world of Savlar, come equipped with their distinctive rebreathers, bulky 4-tube canisters with filter masks that protect against the poisonous atmosphere of their homeworld. These rebreathers are frequently modified with nitro, chem inhalers, devices that allow the chem dogs to inhale combat drugs that put them into hyper-aggressive states during battle. Unlike the Frenzon dispensers built into explosive collars, which are controlled by handlers, the chem dogs' inhalers are often at least partially under the user's control. This creates situations where chem dogs enter battle already high on combat stimulants, fearless and aggressive in ways that make them terrifying close quarters fighters. The downside is significant. Withdrawal from these chemicals can make Savlar troops unstable and dangerous even to their own side, prone to violent outbursts if deprived of their chemical courage. Equipment theft and scavenging form a significant part of Penal Legion culture, particularly among the Savlar Chem dogs who have a notorious reputation for stealing from other Imperial units. This isn't officially sanctioned, but it's tacitly acknowledged by commanders who recognize that better equipped legionnaires are more effective fighters. A chem dog who steals a superior Armageddon pattern rebreather from a supply depot is a chem dog who can fight longer in toxic environments. A legionnaire who acquires a better lasgun through questionable means is a legionnaire with better range and accuracy. The Imperium's response to such theft is theoretically severe, equipment theft being a crime that could see a legionnaire executed. But in practice, commissars often turn a blind eye, as long as the stealing doesn't impact other Imperial units' combat readiness and the legionnaires don't get too brazen. This creates a strange ecosystem where Penal legionnaires are simultaneously punished for criminal behavior and rewarded when that criminal behavior makes them more useful to the war effort. The psychological impact of inferior equipment cannot be overstated. When a Penal legionnaire looks at regular guard units with their better weapons, thicker armor, and generous ammunition supplies, the message is clear: your life is worth less than theirs. You are disposable in ways they are not. This knowledge eats at morale, creating resentment and reinforcement of the legionnaires' status as outcasts. Yet it also creates motivation for some. A legionnaire who survives long enough and fights well enough might earn transfer to a regular unit, which means, among other things, escaping the degrading experience of being equipped like refuse. The promise of better equipment becomes tangled with the promise of redemption, both representing a future where the Imperium treats you like an actual soldier, rather than a walking corpse with a delay timer. For the survivors who persist through multiple deployments, equipment becomes deeply personal. A lascarbine that has functioned reliably through a dozen battles is worth more than any factory, fresh replacement, its quirks and characteristics understood intimately. A flak vest that has absorbed shrapnel and fire becomes a talisman, proof that survival is possible even in this condemned existence. Veteran legionnaires mark their equipment with scratches and symbols, unauthorized but rarely punished, creating visual records of their service that official channels won't acknowledge. These personal touches transform standard, issue gear into something more meaningful. Individual identity asserted through the very tools meant to ensure their deaths. And when a veteran legionnaire falls, their equipment is immediately claimed by survivors. Not just for its utility but for its history, the knowledge that this weapon or this armor helped someone survive when survival seemed impossible. In this way, equipment becomes legacy, each piece carrying the accumulated experience of all who wielded it before, a material connection to the possibility that death is not inevitable, that some can beat the odds, that somewhere beyond the explosive collar and the suicide missions, there might be redemption. Tici impasse ibel mitie is of survival. The statistics are stark and unambiguous. Most penal legionnaires die in their first battle, not their first month of service, not their first deployment, but their very first engagement with enemy forces. The attrition rate in that initial contact often exceeds 70%, with some battles seeing 90% casualties among fresh penal legion units. These numbers are not accidents or failures of planning. They are the intended outcome of a system designed to extract one final use from condemned criminals before disposing of them. Yet within those grim statistics lies a mathematical paradox that the Imperium rarely acknowledges. If most die in their first battle, then those who survive that first battle represent a fundamentally different population than those who didn't. They are the resistant strain, the statistical outliers, the individuals who through skill, luck, or sheer stubborn refusal to die have beaten odds that killed their comrades. And once you've survived your first battle as a penal legionnaire, your chances of surviving the next one are significantly better than they were the first time. This creates what military analysts might call a survival bias effect within penal legion units. The longer a legionnaire survives, the more likely they are to continue surviving, not because the battles get easier, but because they themselves become more capable. They learn which sounds mean incoming artillery and which are simply ambient battlefield noise. They develop instincts for when to advance and when to find cover. They understand the rhythm of combat, the ebb and flow that separates those who live from those who die. This accumulated experience is worth more than any amount of training, and it shows in the casualty rates. A penal legion unit composed entirely of veterans who have survived multiple engagements might take only 20 or 30% casualties in a battle that would have killed 70% of fresh troops. The Imperium, with its typical inefficiency and bureaucratic blindness, often fails to recognize this pattern, continuing to treat all penal legionnaires as equally disposable, even when experience clearly demonstrates that some are considerably more capable of surviving than others. The famous case of the 13th Penal Legion illustrates this mathematical reality with brutal clarity. In the period before the Second Tyrannic War, the Legion consisted of approximately 4,000 troops, a regiment-sized formation of condemned criminals drawn from across the Imperium. They were deployed into the worst combat zones imaginable, battles against Tyranids, orcs, chaos forces, and other threats where survival seemed impossible. Over the course of roughly 2 years of continuous combat, the 4,000 were whittled down through attrition. Not 4,000 deaths in 2 years, which would have been unsustainable even for a penal legion. Rather, the gradual loss of less capable fighters, while the truly skilled or lucky survived. When the legion was finally withdrawn from combat, unit strength had been reduced to approximately 250 effectives. Simple math tells us that nearly 4,000 men and women died or were otherwise lost during that period. But those 250 who remained represented something special: survivors. They had each endured countless battles, witnessed the deaths of thousands of their comrades, and somehow persisted when everything about their situation was designed to kill them. This winnowing process, this brutal filtration of Penal Legion units through continuous combat until only the hardest core remains, creates units with capabilities that sometimes rival or exceed elite formations from regular guard regiments. A Penal Legionnaire who has survived 20 battles has more practical combat experience than many officers who graduated from prestigious scholars but have seen limited field service. They know things that can't be taught: muscle memory and tactical intuition burned into their nervous systems through repeated exposure to life or death situations. The Imperium, despite its general disregard for Penal Legion lives, is not entirely blind to this reality. Some units, particularly specialized formations like Colonel Schaefer's 13th Penal Legion, actively exploit the winnowing process. They deliberately deploy large formations into hellish combat zones, not expecting most to survive, but knowing that those who do will be extraordinarily capable. These survivors then form the core of smaller, more elite units capable of missions that regular guard formations couldn't accomplish. The psychological mathematics of survival are equally important, though harder to quantify. A Penal Legionnaire's first battle is terrifying in ways that defy description. You're driven forward into enemy fire, explosive collar around your neck, handlers behind you ready to detonate it if you try to retreat, enemies ahead who want to kill you, and the absolute certainty that you are expected to die today. The fear is overwhelming, primal, the kind that turns your bowels to water and makes rational thought nearly impossible. Most legionnaires in their first battle are barely functional, firing their weapons wildly, advancing because the alternative is immediate execution, dying because they don't yet understand how to not die. Those who survive report that first battle as a blur of terror and chaos, time dilating and contracting in strange ways, memories fragmented and incomplete. But those who make it through, who somehow find cover when they need it, who duck at the right moment, who keep their weapon functioning when others jam, emerge changed. They've crossed a threshold that their dead comrades never reached. They know what it feels like to survive when survival seemed impossible. That knowledge, that experiential proof that death is not inevitable despite everything, becomes a psychological foundation for future survival. A legionnaire entering their second battle is still terrified, but no longer paralyzed by that terror. They've done this before and lived. They know the fear won't kill them, that functionality is possible, even in extremis, that there are actions they can take to improve their chances. This isn't confidence exactly. Confidence suggests belief in a positive outcome, and no Penal Legionnaire can truly believe that. Rather, it's competence, the knowledge that you can function in this environment, even when every instinct screams to curl up and die. That competence grows with each survived engagement, layer upon layer of experience accumulating, until the Legionnaire operates almost on instinct, reading the battlefield and responding without conscious thought. Yet survival has costs that don't show up in casualty statistics. Every battle survived means watching comrades die. The Penal Legionnaire advancing beside you, the one who shared his rations last night, the one who told jokes to keep morale up, you watch him take a las, bolt to the chest and fall. Watch him bleed out because there's no time to help the wounded in a Penal Legion advance. You keep moving because stopping means dying, and his corpse joins the hundreds of others you've stepped over. This accumulation of death, this repeated exposure to mass casualty events, warps the psyche in ways the Imperium neither understands nor cares about. Penal Legion survivors become numb to death, their own and others. They develop a fatalistic worldview where life is measured in moments rather than futures. They form shallow attachments because forming deep ones means suffering deep losses when those people inevitably die. Some become actively suicidal, continuing to advance and fight not because they want to live, but because dying well seems better than dying badly. Others become almost sociopathic, viewing themselves and their comrades as already dead, and therefore not worth emotional investment. The physical toll of continuous combat also accumulates in ways that statistics don't capture. A penal legionnaire might survive a battle, but collect shrapnel wounds that never fully heal. Lost burns leave permanent scarring. Near misses from explosions cause hearing loss or traumatic brain injuries. Malnutrition from poor rations and combat stress weaken the immune system. Repeated exposure to combat drugs like Frenzon can cause long-term neurological damage. A legionnaire who survives 20 battles might be alive, by the most technical definition, but carrying injuries that would disqualify them from service in any formation that cared about long-term health. The Imperium doesn't care. As long as a legionnaire can hold a weapon and follow basic orders, they're functional. If they die from accumulated wounds between battles, well, that was always the plan anyway. Yet despite all these costs, survival remains possible. The mathematics prove it. From formations of thousands, hundreds survive. From hundreds, dozens persist. And occasionally, impossibly, individual legionnaires survive long enough to complete their sentences or earn redemption. Emerging from the meat grinder as something the system never intended them to be, veterans who earned their freedom through blood. These survivors represent statistical anomalies, data points so far from the expected outcome that they challenge the assumptions underlying Penal Legion doctrine. If the purpose is to kill these criminals in battle, then their survival represents a failure of that purpose. If the purpose is to extract useful military service from condemned prisoners, then their survival represents success. Individuals who have paid their debt in blood and could theoretically be reintegrated. The Imperium's response to these survivors is telling it doesn't really have one. The system wasn't designed to handle them. They exist in a bureaucratic and legal grey area. Criminals who have technically completed their sentences, but who remain marked by explosive collar scars and unit tattoos. Veterans with skills and experience, but criminal records that follow them forever. The ultimate irony of Penal Legion survival mathematics is that the system, despite being designed to kill, actually creates some of the most capable individual fighters in the Imperial Guard through simple evolutionary pressure. Throw enough people into enough meat grinders, and the ones who emerge are either the luckiest or the most skilled, often both. These survivors could be valuable assets if properly utilized, veterans whose combat experience exceeds most officers, whose instincts and reflexes have been honed through dozens of life or death encounters. Some formations, the Last Chancers being the most famous example, recognize and exploit this reality. Most don't. Most Penal Legion survivors simply continue to serve until they eventually run out of luck. Or they're transferred to regular guard units, where their skills can be properly employed, or in the rarest cases, they earn complete redemption and freedom. The mathematics of survival promise only that beating the odds once makes beating them again slightly more probable. It's not much of a promise. But in the grim darkness of the far future, for those wearing explosive collars and fighting for a system that wants them dead, it's sometimes enough. Last Shen Sias Elite Mun Diamond. Among the numerous Penal Legions scattered across the Imperium, one unit stands apart as both legend and experiment. The 13th Penal Legion, known informally as the Last Chancers, represents something unique in Imperial military history. A Penal Legion deliberately designed to create elite survivors, rather than simply consume criminals. Under the command of the enigmatic Colonel Schaefer, the Last Chancers operate with a methodology that transforms the typical Penal Legion meat grinder into something approaching special operations. They take the mathematical reality we discussed, that survivors of initial battles become increasingly capable, and weaponize it, deliberately culling large formations down to small teams of extraordinary individuals. The Last Chancers are proof that even in the Imperium's most damned formations, exceptional capability can emerge from the crucible of survival. Colonel Schaefer himself is a figure wrapped in mystery and contradiction. He's a colonel within the commissariat structure, which grants him authority over Penal Legion formations, but his actual allegiances and objectives remain opaque even to most Imperial authorities. His age is uncertain. with some records suggesting he's been commanding versions of the 13th Penal Legion for far longer than normal human lifespan would permit. His connections to the Inquisition are well documented but poorly understood, with Schaefer seeming to answer to inquisitorial directives while maintaining independence from standard commissariat oversight. He selects Penal legionnaires personally, reviewing military records and criminal files from across the Imperium to identify individuals with specific skills or capabilities. A sniper who committed murder, an explosives expert caught stealing, a tech adept who sold Forge world secrets. Schaefer finds them all, offering them what he calls a last chance at redemption. The methodology Schaefer employs is brutal but effective. In his earlier operations, he would gather thousands of convicted Imperial Guard personnel, sometimes assembling regiment-sized formations of 4,000 or more condemned soldiers. These massive units would then be deployed into the absolute worst combat zones available, fighting against overwhelming odds in environments where survival seemed mathematically impossible. Battle after battle, deployment after deployment, the thousands would be whittled down through sheer attrition. Most died, as Penal legionnaires are expected to die, but some, those with exceptional skills, unusual instincts, or simply supernatural luck, somehow survived. Schaefer wasn't trying to save these thousands, he was filtering them, using combat itself as a selection mechanism to identify the truly capable from the merely condemned. When a formation of 4,000 had been reduced to 250, or 100, or eventually just a dozen, Schaefer had what he wanted: the resistant strain. The survivors whose capabilities had been proven through the most demanding test imaginable. These survivors, these hardened criminals in the most literal sense, would then be informed of Schaefer's true objective. They weren't being saved out of mercy. They were being recruited for missions that required their specific combination of skills and willingness to die trying. Assassination of enemy commanders, infiltration of heavily fortified positions, sabotage of critical infrastructure, intelligence gathering behind enemy lines, all the dirty, dangerous work that regular guard formations couldn't accomplish and that even elite units would find nearly impossible. Schaefer would present these survivors with a choice. Though calling it a choice is generous, they could accept the mission with the promise of a full Imperial pardon if they succeeded and survived. Or they could refuse, in which case they would be transferred to regular Penal Legion service, essentially returning to the meat grinder that had killed their thousands of comrades. Most accepted Schaefer's offer, not because they believed they would survive, but because death on a mission with purpose seemed preferable to death as nameless cannon fodder. The training these last chancers received was unlike anything in standard Penal Legion service. Schaefer maintained a secret penal facility, location unknown even to most Imperial authorities, where selected criminals would undergo months of intensive preparation. This wasn't basic guard training. This was specialized instruction in everything from urban infiltration to wilderness survival, from assassination techniques to advanced demolitions work. The recruits were pushed to their limits and beyond, tested in every conceivable environment and combat scenario. Those who couldn't keep up, who broke under the pressure or failed to master necessary skills, were cycled back into regular Penal legions. Those who succeeded emerged as something unique in the Imperial arsenal, condemned criminals with capabilities rivaling those of elite special forces. Individuals who had literally nothing to lose and everything to gain from successful mission completion. The composition of Last Chancer units reveals Schaefer's selection methodology. Each member is chosen for specific skills that complement the team. A soldier called Hero, whose real name was Lieutenant Green, earned his place for his leadership capabilities and stubborn refusal to give up even when catastrophically wounded. His crime: refusing a pointless and suicidal order, valuing his men's lives over blind obedience. Ox brought raw physical power and close-quarters lethality, having killed 3 officers with his bare hands in a drunken brawl. Fingers provided procurement skills and an ability to acquire anything needed through theft or barter, his crime being black marketeering. Demolition Man was an expert with explosives, capable of defeating any lock or security system. Condemned for breaking into an officer's personal supplies, Grace Monkey could maintain, drive, and repair any Imperial vehicle, despite being sentenced for unauthorized mechanical work. Brains brought technical and hacking expertise, though his crime was relatively minor, altering his own pay records. Each member represented a specific capability, and together they formed a team that could adapt to virtually any situation. The missions undertaken by the Last Chancers pushed the boundaries of what Penal Legion units were thought capable of accomplishing. In one documented operation, a small Last Chancer team infiltrated a Toll commander's compound by posing first as diplomatic envoys and then as mercenaries. They penetrated layers of security that would have stopped conventional Imperial forces, adapted to alien culture and technology on the fly, and successfully assassinated their target despite being surrounded by hostile forces. In another mission, Last Chancers were tasked with infiltrating and destroying a massive rebel stronghold from within by overloading its plasma reactors. The operation required technical expertise, stealth combat skills, and split-second decision-making under impossible pressure. Regular guard units couldn't have accomplished these objectives. Even elite formations would have struggled. But the Last Chancers, with their unique combination of skills, criminal mindsets, and absolute commitment born of having no other options, succeeded where others would have failed. The psychology of Last Chancer service is fascinating and dark. These are individuals who have been given actual hope. Not the vague promise that dying in battle will redeem their souls, but concrete pardons contingent on mission success and survival. This changes the calculus entirely. A regular Penal Legionnaire fights because the alternative is immediate execution, advancing into enemy fire, because handlers will kill them if they don't. A Last Chancer fights because success means freedom, because there is an actual light at the end of the tunnel, even if the tunnel is filled with enemies trying to kill them. This creates motivation that transcends simple fear or drug-induced frenzy. Last Chancers want to survive, actively scheme and plan and cooperate to maximize their chances, employ their criminal ingenuity and military skills in pursuit of an objective that matters to them personally. Yet this hope is also weaponized against them. Schaefer keeps the written pardons with him, sometimes showing them to his Last Chancers to remind them what's at stake. He writes pardons for every Last Chancer who dies in service, granting them posthumous redemption as a final gesture. This creates a perverse incentive structure where death in service is honored and rewarded with spiritual redemption, while survival is rewarded with actual freedom. The Last Chancers exist in a state of perpetual calculation, weighing their chances, deciding which risks are worth taking for the promise of freedom versus which risks are simply suicide. Schaefer exploits this psychology ruthlessly, using the promise of pardons to extract maximum effort, while also making it clear that the pardons are only meaningful if they survive to receive them. The fate of Last Chancer survivors illustrates the complexity of their situation. Lieutenant Cage, one of the most well-documented Last Chancers, survived his first mission with Schaefer and received his pardon. He was released, free to return to civilian life or regular guard service as he chose. But freedom didn't erase his past or the psychological damage accumulated through his service. Cage eventually committed murder again, killing 3 senior officers when his personal demons caught up with him. Schaefer, who had apparently been monitoring his former Last Chancer, immediately recruited him back into the 13th Penal Legion. This cycle repeated. Cage would survive missions, earn redemption, return to freedom, and then commit new crimes that brought him back into Schaefer's orbit. It's unclear whether Schaefer deliberately allowed this to happen, whether he wanted Cage's specific skills badly enough to let him spiral back into criminality. But the pattern suggests that for some Last Chancers, survival only leads to more damnation, the skills and experiences they accumulated making them simultaneously valuable to the Imperium and dangerous to society. The Last Chancers represent the upper bound of what Penal Legion survivors can become: elite operators whose criminal backgrounds are transformed into assets rather than liabilities. They prove that the system, despite being designed to kill, can create extraordinary capability through its brutal selection pressures. Yet they also illustrate the fundamental contradiction in Penal Legion redemption. Even when criminals are given genuine chances to earn freedom, even when they succeed against impossible odds and receive their pardons, the damage done by their service often ensures they cannot successfully reintegrate. The last chances are free until they're not. They're redeemed until they commit new sins. They're survivors, but survival has costs that no pardon can erase. And through it all, Connell Schaefer continues his work, gathering condemned criminals, filtering them through combat, creating teams of desperate specialists, and deploying them on missions where their lives are the currency and their deaths are the expected price. In this way, the last chances embody both the hope and the horror of Penal Legion survival, proof that redemption is possible, and evidence that it might not be enough. The Sevilla, Chiem Diochis Avi Brown. Not all Penal Legions follow the standard Imperial model of condemned criminals driven into battle under threat of execution. Some, through quirks of geography, culture, and administrative compromise, develop their own distinct character, while still serving the fundamental purpose of extracting military utility from society's outcasts. The Savla Chem dogs represent perhaps the most unique variation on the Penal Legion concept. Units drawn from a single toxic world, where criminality is less a deviation from the norm than simply the standard operating procedure. They fight not primarily out of fear of execution, but out of greed, promise they can keep whatever they loot from battlefields as payment for their service. This creates a Penal Legion formation that is somehow both more mercenary and more reliable than standard units. Condemned soldiers who fight with enthusiasm born of profit motive rather than drugged-up frenzy or terror of their handlers. Savla itself is a hellhole, a penal world whose toxic atmosphere and volcanic moons make it barely habitable, even with protective equipment. The planet was once a mining colony, valued for its rich chemical deposits, but cursed with an environment that killed workers almost as fast as they could be shipped in. When the world failed to meet its imperial tithers in the 39th millennium, it was converted into a penal settlement, with the administratum reasoning that condemned criminals could extract the chemicals needed while simultaneously serving their sentences. What followed was predictable. The influx of criminals from across the sector transformed Savlar into a society defined entirely by violence, theft, and survival. Without the strictures of normal imperial society, with constant exposure to toxic chemicals and minimal oversight beyond maintaining production quotas, the population of Savlar developed its own brutal culture. Gangs fought over territory. Murder was so common it barely warranted notice. Rape was endemic enough that most Savlar born couldn't identify their fathers. The Adeptus Arbits maintained order only to the extent necessary to keep the chemical production flowing. The transformation of Savlar's criminal population into a military resource began during an armed uprising on the planet itself. Judge Callistar, a senior Adeptus Arbits magistrate overseeing Savlar, faced a simple problem: millions of violent criminals threatening to riot, and insufficient Arbits forces to suppress them through direct violence. Callistar's solution was inspired in its cynicism. Rather than try to impose order through force, he offered the criminals a deal. Join the Chem Dogs, fight in the Emperor's wars, and you can keep whatever you loot from the battlefields. Break imperial law while serving, and you go back to Savlar's prisons. The offer worked better than anyone expected. The criminals of Savlar, raised in a culture where theft and violence were survival skills, responded enthusiastically to the promise of sanctioned looting. The Chem Dogs were born, and when the Third War for Armageddon created desperate need for troops, Savlar's criminals were conscripted en masse. The Chem Dogs' distinctive appearance and equipment reflect their toxic homeworld and chemical-addled culture. Every Chem Dog wears a rebreather bulky 4-tube canister systems with filter masks that protect against Savlar's poisonous atmosphere. These rebreathers are frequently modified with nitro, chem inhalers, devices that allow the wearer to inhale combat drugs at will. Unlike standard Penal Legion Frenzen dispensers controlled by handlers, many CHEM dog inhalers give at least partial control to the user. This creates a culture of continuous drug use, with CHEM dogs inhaling various chemical cocktails to enhance aggression, suppress fear, or simply chase the high that makes their miserable existence bearable. The variety of chemicals used is staggering, ranging from combat stimulants that increase reflexes and aggression to psychoactive substances that make the user fearless to the point of psychosis. The CHEM dogs are essentially huffing paint and charging into battle, their courage chemically induced but no less effective for it. Beyond rebreathers, CHEM dog equipment is a chaotic mix of standard issue, stolen property, and improvised gear. Official loadouts include lasguns, flak armor, and basic support weapons like heavy bolters and flamers. But walk through a CHEM dog formation and you'll see soldiers carrying non-standard weapons acquired through theft or battlefield scavenging, wearing improvised armor cobbled together from scavenged materials, using Vox equipment stolen from other Imperial units. The CHEM dogs are notorious thieves, stopping to loot corpses even in the middle of active battles, stripping enemy and friendly dead alike for anything valuable. This behavior technically violates military regulations, but commissars assigned to CHEM dog units have learned to tolerate it as long as the looting doesn't impact combat effectiveness. A CHEM dog who has stolen a superior weapon is a CHEM dog who fights better. The promise that they can keep their loot provides motivation that threats of execution can't match. The CHEM dogs excel in specific combat environments that play to their strengths. Urban warfare, particularly fighting in the cramped, toxic underhives of worlds like Armageddon, is where they shine brightest. The close quarters combat, the noxious atmosphere that requires sealed environmental protection, the chaotic nature of room-to-room fighting, all favor the CHEM dog's aggressive, drug-fueled approach. They excel at the kind of brutal, nasty work that regular guard units find psychologically difficult, clearing hive sectors block by block, fighting through toxic waste zones, engaging in knife-range firefights in pitch-black tunnels. The CHEM dogs embrace this environment, their rebreathers keeping them functional where others would succumb to chemical weapons or environmental hazards. Their drug-enhanced aggression making them fearless in situations that would break the morale of more conventional units. The command structure of CHEM dog regiments reflects their unique origin and culture. Officers are never drawn from Savla itself, instead coming from Schola Progenium facilities, where orphans are raised in Imperial doctrine and trained for service. The Imperium's distrust of Savla, born is so complete that local recruitment of officers is considered impossible. These Schola-raised officers command units filled with criminals from one of the Imperium's most lawless worlds, creating inevitable tension between commanders who believe in discipline and order and soldiers who grew up in a society where might made right and theft was a survival skill. To bridge this gap and maintain discipline, CHEM dog regiments include commissars in unusually high numbers, overseeing formations that are technically penal legions, even if they function somewhat differently than standard condemned units. Some CHEM dog regiments employ a unique command element called mercies, officers who serve as both provost and warden for their penal charges. These mercies dress similarly to commissars, black flak coats and peaked caps, carrying bolt pistols as symbols of their authority. They exist outside the normal chain of command, addressing and addressed as Sir by all other officers including colonels, yet they answer directly to the regimental commissar. Mercies are empowered to dispense summary judgment and execution, collecting identification tags from fallen legionnaires and maintaining records that the chaotic nature of CHEM dog service often obscures. The presence of mercies creates an additional layer of control, ensuring that even if standard discipline breaks down, there remains authority capable of restoring order through immediate violence. The combat record of the CHEM dogs is impressive despite, or perhaps because of their criminal origins and chaotic nature. During the Third War for Armageddon, multiple CHEM dog regiments including the famous 14th were deployed to defend the planet's underhives against Orc invasion. The orcs, themselves enthusiastic close, combat fighters who thrive in chaotic melee, met their match in the Chem dogs. The criminals of Savla fought with a ferocity that matched the greenskins, fueled by combat drugs and motivated by the prospect of looting orc corpses for trophies and salvage. The cramped, toxic environment of Armageddon's underhives played perfectly to Chem dogs' strengths, with their rebreathers allowing them to fight in areas where atmospheric conditions would kill or disable regular guard units. Accounts from the war describe Chem dogs holding impossible positions, counter-attacking when retreat would have been sensible, engaging orcs in hand-to-hand combat with a savagery that impressed even hardened veterans. Yet the Chem dogs' criminal nature creates persistent problems that undermine their effectiveness. Theft from other Imperial units is constant and endemic, with Chem dogs stealing everything from weapons and ammunition to food supplies and personal items. This creates friction with other regiments, forced to serve alongside them, as soldiers who wake to find their gear missing are understandably reluctant to trust or cooperate with known thieves. Tensions between the Chem dogs and other Astra Militarum formations occasionally explode into violence. In one documented incident during the Third War for Armageddon, the Savla 14th Chem dogs were combined with the Necromundan 86th into a mixed regiment. The cultural clash between the two units was so severe that they eventually turned on each other, fighting fellow Imperials with the same enthusiasm they brought to fighting orcs. Such incidents reinforce the perception that Chem dogs, while useful in specific circumstances, are fundamentally unreliable and dangerous even to their own side. The psychological profile of Chem dog survivors is distinct from other Penal Legion veterans, where standard legionnaires are ground down by fear and brutality, becoming numb and fatalistic. Chem dog veterans are shaped by greed and chemical addiction. They survive not just because they've learned combat skills, but because they have powerful motivation to keep fighting the promise of loot, the need to maintain access to combat drugs, and the knowledge that being sent back to Savlar is a fate they desperately want to avoid. This creates a different kind of survivor, one who is mercenary in the truest sense, fighting for pay and plunder rather than redemption or fear of punishment. Some of these survivors become extraordinarily wealthy by the standards of common soldiers, accumulating contraband and battlefield salvage over multiple deployments. Others spend their loot as fast as they acquire it, on drugs, gambling, or bribes. But the motivation remains constant: continue fighting, continue looting, continue surviving, because the alternative, being sent back to Savlar or being executed for refusing to serve, is unacceptable. The long-term fate of Chem dog survivors follows patterns similar to other Penal legions, but with unique twists. Some earn enough goodwill or prove themselves valuable enough to be transferred to regular guard regiments, their chemical dependencies and criminal backgrounds overlooked in favor of their combat prowess. Others, the truly exceptional, return to Savlar and pass on their hard-won experience to the next generation of Chem dogs, creating a lineage of battlefield knowledge that persists despite the Imperium's best efforts to suppress it. Like moths drawn to flame, these die-hard survivors return to Savlar, teaching younger criminals the skills that kept them alive through campaigns that should have killed them. In this way, the Savlar Chem dogs develop an institutional memory and combat doctrine that exceeds what should be possible for a Penal Legion formation. They are condemned criminals, yes, but they are also veterans who have found a way to survive and even profit from a system designed to consume them. Their existence proves that even the Imperium's most chaotic and undisciplined formations can achieve effectiveness when given proper motivation, even if that motivation is simple greed and the promise of sanctioned theft. PHTO RedMPTIOM, the concept of redemption lies at the heart of Penal Legion service. Yet what redemption means, and how it can be achieved, varies wildly depending on the unit, the commanding officers, and the specific circumstances of an individual legionnaire's crimes and service. The Imperium officially promises that death in battle absolves all sins, that a legionnaire who falls while fighting the Emperor's enemies will be forgiven their transgressions and granted the Emperor's peace in death. This is a spiritual redemption, a promise about the state of the soul rather than any material reward. For most penal legionnaires, this is the only redemption they will ever receive: death as absolution. Their names carved on a memorial somewhere if they're lucky, forgotten entirely if they're not. But for the rare survivors who persist through multiple engagements, who refuse to die on schedule, other paths to redemption occasionally open, narrow and treacherous but theoretically traversable. The most direct path to redemption is through extraordinary acts of battlefield valor that cannot be ignored even by commanders predisposed to see penal legionnaires as irredeemable filth. The standards for what constitutes extraordinary are impossibly high, far beyond what would earn a regular guardsman a commendation. A penal legionnaire who single-handedly holds a critical position against overwhelming odds, who saves an officer's life at risk of their own, who captures an enemy standard or assassinates a high-value target, might earn consideration for redemption. Might. The decision is ultimately subjective, depending on whether the witnessing officers believe the act demonstrates genuine reformation of character rather than simply desperate self-preservation. This subjectivity creates a system where identical acts of heroism might earn one legionnaire freedom, while another receives only a posthumous pardon and a note in their record. When redemption through valor is granted, it typically takes the form of a full imperial pardon, a legal document that forgives all previous crimes and restores the individual to regular imperial citizenship. In theory, this means the former legionnaire could return to civilian life, find employment, start a family, live as though their criminal past never happened. In practice, the reality is far more complicated. The explosive collar scars remain, permanent marks around the neck that identify the bearer as a former legionnaire to anyone who knows what to look for. The unit tattoos, often placed on the forehead or scalp, can be removed with expensive procedures but leave scarring of their own. Even if physical marks could be erased, the psychological damage remains. A person who has survived multiple penal legion deployments has been fundamentally changed by the experience, traumatized in ways that make normal civilian existence difficult or impossible. Many pardoned legionnaires struggle to reintegrate, finding themselves unable to relate to people who haven't shared their experiences, haunted by memories of battles and dead comrades. The alternative to civilian reintegration is transfer to regular Astra Militarum service, and this is the path most successfully redeemed legionnaires follow. Their pardon grants them the legal status of regular guardsmen, wiping their criminal record clean at least on official documents, and they are assigned to standard guard regiments. This provides structure and purpose that eases the transition, allowing former legionnaires to continue doing what they've become good at, fighting, without the stigma and brutality of penal legion service. They receive better equipment, regular pay, treatment as soldiers rather than condemned criminals. For many, this represents redemption enough, not freedom from service, but freedom from being treated as disposable, acknowledgement that they have value beyond their utility as cannon fodder. Yet even transfer to regular guard units carries complications. Other soldiers often learn about a transfer's past, whether through scuttlebutt, observing collar scars, or simple bureaucratic leaks. The knowledge that someone served in a penal legion creates prejudice and suspicion. They must have done something terrible to wind up there. What if they relapse into criminal behavior? Can they really be trusted? Former penal legionnaires in regular units frequently find themselves isolated, shunned by comrades who view them as tainted. They may be given the dangerous assignments, volunteered for suicide missions, excluded from social groups. This creates a cruel irony. They've earned redemption, proven themselves through extraordinary service, only to discover that the stain of their past service may never fully wash away. Some former legionnaires thrive despite this prejudice, their combat experience and proven toughness eventually earning grudging respect. Others never fully integrate, remaining on the margins of their new units, neither fully accepted nor entirely rejected. The unique case of the last chances demonstrates another path to redemption, one that is simultaneously more generous and more cruel than standard Penal Legion service. Colonel Schaefer offers his recruits full Imperial pardons, contingent on surviving and completing specific missions. These aren't vague promises of redemption through accumulating service. They're concrete legal documents that Schaefer carries with him, writing pardons for each last chancer, whether they survive or not. Those who die receive posthumous redemption, their souls theoretically cleansed, even if their bodies feed crows on some distant battlefield. Those who survive and complete their missions receive actual freedom, the pardons handed over in recognition of service completed and objectives achieved. This creates clear, achievable redemption in a way that standard Penal Legion service never does. Yet the reality of Last Chancer redemption reveals its darker aspects. The missions Schaefer assigns are extraordinarily dangerous, designed to require skills and capabilities that only proven survivors possess. The casualty rates, while lower than standard Penal Legion deployments, remain brutally high. Many Last Chancers earn their redemption only to die before they can enjoy it, taking a last bolt in the final moments of a mission they've struggled through for months. Others survive but are so damaged by the experience that freedom becomes meaningless. Lieutenant Cage's cycle of redemption freedom, relapse into criminal behavior, and recruitment into the Last Chancers illustrates this pattern. The skills and psychological adaptations that let him survive as a Penal Legionnaire made him fundamentally unsuited for normal life. He knew how to fight, how to survive in extreme conditions, how to make split-second life or death decisions. He didn't know how to hold a civilian job, maintain normal relationships, or exist in a society where violence wasn't the primary mode of interaction. So he returned to what he knew, committed new crimes, and found himself back in Schaefer's service. The cycle beginning again. Some Penal Legion survivors find redemption not through official channels, but through simply outlasting the system. They serve year after year, deployment after deployment, surviving through combination of skill and luck until eventually they're the senior legionnaires in their units. Veterans whose experience makes them valuable to officers desperate for competent NCOs. At some point, through bureaucratic oversight or deliberate command decision, their status shifts from condemned criminal to serving soldier. The explosive collar comes off, replaced by regular insignia. Their sentences are quietly commuted not through official pardon, but through administrative erosion, paperwork lost, or deliberately misfiled. Records indicating completion of service that may or may not be accurate. These unofficial redemptions lack the legal clarity of formal pardons, but they achieve similar results. Former legionnaires integrated into regular service, their past crimes informally forgiven, even if never officially pardoned. The spiritual dimension of redemption deserves consideration, particularly in the context of the Imperium's religious character. For many Penal Legionnaires, the promise that death in battle absolves sin is taken literally and seriously. They genuinely believe that dying while fighting the Emperor's enemies will cleanse their souls, ensuring their place in the Emperor's embrace after death. This belief can be powerful motivation, transforming condemned criminals into fanatical fighters, willing to sacrifice themselves for even marginal tactical advantage. Chaplains and priests attached to Penal Legion units reinforce this messaging, conducting prayers and rituals that emphasize redemption through sacrifice. For legionnaires who die believing their souls are saved, this spiritual redemption is real and meaningful regardless of whether officers grant official pardons. But for survivors, spiritual redemption creates theological complications. If death absolves sin, what does survival mean? Are they still sinners? Have they proven themselves through their service? Or do they need to die to truly achieve redemption? Different legionnaires answer these questions differently. Some become fatalistic, believing they've simply postponed their inevitable redemption through death. Others interpret survival as evidence of the Emperor's favor, proof that their souls are worth saving. The inconsistency in official redemption policies, where one officer might grant pardons for heroism while another never does, reinforces the sense that redemption is uncertain and arbitrary, dependent more on the whims of commanders than any objective measure of service or character. The truth about redemption for Penal Legion survivors is that it remains fundamentally uncertain. The Imperium promises absolution through death, and that promise is kept reliably, carved on memorials and recorded in whatever records survive the chaos of war. But redemption through survival is rare, conditional, and often incomplete. Even official pardons don't erase scars or memories. Even transfer to regular units doesn't grant acceptance or peace. The paths to redemption exist, proven by the minority who walk them successfully. But they remain narrow and treacherous, lined with prejudice and trauma, leading to destinations that may not resemble the freedom that legionnaires imagined when they accepted service over execution. For most who survive, redemption is less a destination reached than a process never quite completed, a promise perpetually deferred, a hope that keeps them moving forward even when the way ahead remains dark and uncertain. Teach Piswai Sichu Lisel Tal Ofsar Vivel to survive as a Penal legionnaire is to endure psychological trauma that most human minds aren't equipped to process. The combination of combat stress, expectation of death, brutal conditions, and the knowledge that you're considered disposable creates a mental crucible that breaks some people completely while transforming others in ways that make normal existence impossible. Understanding the psychological toll of Penal Legion survival requires examining not just what these soldiers endure, but how they adapt to endure it. The mental mechanisms they develop to function in an environment designed to kill them, and the long-term consequences of those adaptations, even for those who eventually achieve redemption or freedom. The baseline psychological state of a new Penal legionnaire is terror mixed with despair. They've been sentenced to death with the sentence temporarily stayed on condition of military service. They know statistically that most will die in their first battle. They wear explosive collars that can kill them instantly if they disobey, or if a handler simply decides they're more useful dead than alive. The future has collapsed into the immediate present. No planning for next year or next month or even next week, just survival moment to moment. This psychological compression creates a mental state that clinical psychologists would likely classify as acute stress disorder, though no imperial psychologist wastes time diagnosing condemned criminals. Symptoms include hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts about death, difficulty sleeping, emotional numbing, and dissociation from physical reality. For most new legionnaires, this acute stress is never resolved. They simply die before it can develop into longer-term conditions. For those who survive their first battle, the psychological impact is profound and often permanent. They've experienced something that confirms their worst fears. That combat is exactly as terrifying and deadly as they imagined, while simultaneously proving that survival is possible even in those conditions. This creates cognitive dissonance. The simultaneous knowledge that they should be dead and the reality that they're not. Different legionnaires resolve this dissonance in different ways. Some develop fatalistic worldviews, believing they're living on borrowed time and that death is merely delayed rather than avoided. This can manifest as reckless behavior in subsequent battles, fighting with suicidal courage because they've already accepted their death as inevitable. Others develop obsessive survival behaviors, superstitions and rituals that they believe contributed to their survival and must be maintained to continue surviving. Checking equipment in specific order, carrying particular talismans, following precise pre-battle routines. These behaviors provide psychological control in situations where actual control is minimal. The accumulation of combat trauma through repeated deployments creates what modern psychologists would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Each battle adds layers of trauma, memories of near-death experiences, and witnessed deaths piling up until the legionnaire's psyche is saturated with horror. Flashbacks become common, intrusive memories of specific moments of extreme danger or grief that intrude during quiet moments. Hypervigilance persists even in safe environments, the nervous system unable to downshift from combat, ready alertness. Sleep becomes difficult or impossible without chemical aid, and even when it comes it's plagued by nightmares of past battles or anxiety about future ones. Emotional regulation breaks down, with legionnaires experiencing explosive anger, paralyzing despair, or complete numbness in ways that make interpersonal relationships nearly impossible. Survivor's guilt presents another major psychological challenge for veteran legionnaires. They've watched thousands of comrades die, often in arbitrary ways where one person died because they were standing 2 meters to the left or turned their head at the wrong moment. Why did I survive when they didn't? This question haunts survivors, particularly those who survived not through any particular skill or heroism, but simply through luck. The guilt can be overwhelming, creating feelings that survival itself is morally wrong, that they should have died like their comrades. Some legionnaires resolve this guilt through belief in destiny or divine favor, convincing themselves that the Emperor preserved them for a purpose. Others never resolve it, carrying the weight of thousands of deaths as personal failure, each survived battle adding to the burden. The dehumanization inherent in Penal Legion service creates its own psychological damage. To be told repeatedly that you're disposable, that your life has no value beyond its utility to the war effort, that you're expected and wanted to die, this grinds away at self, worth, and identity. Many legionnaires internalize this messaging, coming to believe that they truly are worthless beyond their capacity for violence. This self-dehumanization can be adaptive in the short term, making it easier to accept impossible risks and suicidal missions. If you already believe your life has no value, then spending it in battle doesn't feel like sacrifice. But this mindset becomes toxic if survival continues, creating individuals who can't conceive of themselves as having worth beyond combat effectiveness, who define their entire identity around their ability to fight and kill. Chemical dependence presents another layer of psychological complexity, particularly for formations like the Savla Chem, dogs or units where frenzen use is common. Combat drugs alter neurochemistry in ways that can create long-term changes in brain function. Repeated frenzen use, for example, can blunt natural fear responses and alter aggression regulation even when not under the drug's influence. Legionnaires who have been combat drug users for extended periods often find that they cannot function normally without chemical assistance, their brains having adapted to the artificial neurochemical states. Withdrawal can be severe, manifesting as violent outbursts, severe depression, or physical symptoms that make the legionnaire non-functional. This creates dependency that persists even if they achieve redemption. Former legionnaires who can't sleep without drugs, can't face stress without chemical courage, can't regulate their moods without pharmaceutical intervention. The erosion of moral boundaries represents one of the most disturbing psychological adaptations to penal legion service. To survive in this environment often requires doing things that most people would consider unthinkable. Looting corpses of comrades before they've cooled. Leaving wounded behind because stopping to help means dying yourself. Watching atrocities committed by allies or enemies and doing nothing because intervention would compromise survival. Committing violence against civilians who might be enemies or might be innocent, but in the chaos and fear of combat you can't tell and don't have time to figure it out. Each of these acts chips away at moral frameworks, creating cumulative damage to the psyche's ethical foundation. Some legionnaires maintain rigid moral codes despite everything, drawing lines they refuse to cross no matter the cost. Others experience progressive moral degradation, each compromise making the next one easier until they've lost any sense of ethical constraint beyond avoiding punishment. This moral erosion can make reintegration into normal society nearly impossible, as the survivor carries with them a capacity for violence and moral flexibility that makes them fundamentally dangerous. The relationships that Penal Legion survivors form with fellow legionnaires create their own psychological dynamics. These bonds are intense, forged through shared trauma and mutual dependence in life or death situations. A legionnaire who covers your advance, who shares their rations when you're starving, who pulls you from cover when you're wounded, that person becomes more important than family, than lovers, than any civilian relationship could be. Yet these bonds are also brittle and tragic. Your closest comrade can die in the next battle, suddenly and arbitrarily. leaving grief that's complicated by the knowledge that forming new attachments just means setting yourself up for more loss. Some legionnaires respond by refusing to form close bonds, maintaining emotional distance from everyone as self-protection. Others form intensely codependent relationships, clinging to the few people who understand them and share their experiences. These patterns persist even after redemption, with former legionnaires struggling to form normal relationships because no one who hasn't shared the experience can truly understand, while simultaneously grieving the loss of comrades who died before achieving freedom. For the rare legionnaires who survive long enough to earn redemption or transfer to regular service, the psychological challenges don't end. They've been shaped by their experiences in ways that make normal existence alien and difficult. They're hypervigilant in situations that don't require it, treating routine interactions as potential threats. They have trauma responses to sounds, smells, or sights that remind them of combat. They struggle with authority that they perceive as arbitrary or unfair, having internalized a very specific relationship with power where authority must be absolute and backed by lethal force. They have difficulty with delayed gratification or long-term planning, their psychology having adapted to an environment where the future was uncertain and immediate survival was all that mattered. Reintegration programs for redeemed penal legionnaires are rare to non-existent, the Imperium generally assuming that transfer to regular guard service is sufficient adjustment. It's not. The psychological damage remains, manifesting in substance abuse, violence, relationship dysfunction, and difficulty adapting to environments where the rules differ from what kept them alive as legionnaires. The ultimate psychological truth about penal legion survivors is that survival itself becomes a form of identity and addiction. They've proven they can survive impossible situations. They know how to function in extreme environments. They understand violence in ways that most people never will. These capabilities become central to their self-conception, who they are defined by what they've endured. This creates a perverse situation where some survivors actively seek out danger, unable to feel fully alive in safe environments, addicted to the adrenaline and intensity of combat. This pattern explains why some redeemed legionnaires commit new crimes or volunteer for dangerous assignments, not because they enjoy suffering, but because it's the only context where they understand themselves. Lieutenant Cage's cycle of redemption and relapse illustrates this perfectly. He survived the last chances, earned freedom, and then couldn't function in that freedom because his entire psychology had been shaped by service in conditions that would kill most people. So he found his way back to those conditions, whether consciously or unconsciously, because they were the only place where he felt competent and purposeful. The psychological toll of survival is that it doesn't end when the danger does. It persists, shaping survivors in ways that outlast their service, creating veterans who are simultaneously proof that the human spirit can endure almost anything and evidence of the permanent damage that endurance causes. Integra TANDSTGMA, the moment a penal legionnaire earns redemption or transfer to regular service marks not an ending, but a transition into a different kind of challenge. They've survived what was meant to kill them. They've proven themselves through extraordinary service or battlefield heroism. They've earned, on paper at least, the right to be treated as regular soldiers or even as free citizens. Yet the reality of integration reveals the persistent power of stigma and the difficulty of erasing a past that has been quite literally carved into flesh through scars and tattoos. The experience of reintegration separates into several distinct patterns depending on whether the former legionnaire transfers to regular guard service, attempts to return to civilian life, or finds themselves in the bureaucratic grey areas where their status remains uncertain. Transfer to regular Astra Militarum units represents the most common path for successfully redeemed legionnaires who wish to continue military service. The formal process is straightforward, at least on paper. The legionnaire's pardon is processed through the Departamento Munitorum, their criminal record is sealed or expunged. Their explosive collar is removed by Adeptus Mechanicus personnel, and they receive assignment to a regular guard regiment, They're issued proper equipment, given actual pay instead of the nothing that Penal legionnaires receive, and theoretically treated as any other guardsman of equivalent experience. In practice, the integration is rarely smooth. The administrative process alone can take months or years, with pardons lost in bureaucratic machinery, transfers delayed by logistics failures, or records mysteriously incomplete. Some former legionnaires spend extended periods in a liminal state, their penal legion service complete, but their regular guard assignments not yet processed, existing in a bureaucratic void, where they're neither condemned nor redeemed. Even when the paperwork is complete, the physical markers of penal legion service create immediate and persistent barriers to integration. The explosive collar, while removed, leaves distinct scarring around the neck, a circular band of damaged tissue that anyone familiar with penal legions recognizes instantly. The unit tattoos, often placed prominently on the forehead or scalp, are similarly indelible. These can theoretically be removed through expensive medical procedures, but such procedures are rarely available to common guardsmen, and even when removed they leave scarring of their own. A former legionnaire might lie about their past, claiming the neck scar came from a different injury, or that the faded tattoo was a youthful indiscretion, but experienced soldiers know better. The marks label the bearer as a former criminal, as someone who was condemned and somehow survived. This creates immediate suspicion and prejudice from comrades who view penal legion service as evidence of fundamental moral failure. The cultural response to former penal legionnaires varies significantly across different guard regiments. Some formations, particularly those from worlds with strict honor cultures, or those that have high opinions of their own moral superiority, treat transfers from penal legions as contamination. The former legionnaire is assigned to the most dangerous duties, volunteered for suicide missions, excluded from social groups, and generally treated as expendable in ways that echo their penal legion service, even though they've supposedly been redeemed. Officers may use them as punishment details, sending them on especially brutal assignments with the barely concealed hope that they won't return. Fellow soldiers shun them in barracks, refuse to share meals or watch duties, spread rumors about what crimes they must have committed to wind up in a penal legion. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where the former legionnaire, isolated and bitter about their treatment, may indeed behave in ways that confirm the prejudices against them. Other regiments, particularly those with more pragmatic or meritocratic cultures, judge former penal legionnaires primarily on their demonstrated capabilities rather than their past sins. A soldier who has survived multiple penal legion deployments has combat experience that exceeds most officers, let alone common guardsmen. They understand violence in ways that training can't teach. They know how to function under impossible pressure, how to keep fighting when wounded or terrified, how to make split-second tactical decisions that mean the difference between life and death. Smart commanders recognize this value and employ former legionnaires accordingly, assigning them to positions where their skills can be maximally useful. This might mean making them squad leaders despite their lack of formal rank, using them as combat trainers for less experienced soldiers, or deploying them as special operations assets for particularly dangerous missions. In such regiments, former legionnaires can earn respect through demonstrated competence, their past serving as proof of their capabilities rather than eternal condemnation. The social dynamics within regular guard units create complex challenges for integrated former legionnaires. They must navigate an environment with different rules than penal legion service, where authority is exercised differently, where violence against comrades results in different consequences, where the threat of immediate execution doesn't hang over every moment. This transition can be difficult for soldiers whose psychology has been shaped by penal legion brutality. A former legionnaire might respond to minor disciplinary issues with violence that seemed proportionate in their previous context, but is wildly inappropriate in regular service. They might struggle with officers who lack the absolute authority backed by explosive collars, questioning orders or demanding justification in ways that Penal Legion handlers would have punished instantly. They might form bonds too quickly or not at all. Their relationship patterns shaped by environments where everyone around you might die tomorrow. The phenomenon of former Penal Legionnaires clustering together when multiple are assigned to the same regiment creates both opportunities and problems. On one hand, these informal networks provide crucial support, connecting individuals who share traumatic experiences and understand each other in ways that regular soldiers cannot. They can help each other navigate the transition, share strategies for dealing with prejudice, provide psychological support during difficult periods. On the other hand, such clusters can be perceived as threatening by command structures and regular soldiers, groups of former criminals banding together, raising fears of mutiny or criminal conspiracy. Commanders sometimes deliberately separate former legionnaires precisely to prevent such groupings, scattering them across different companies or even different regiments to minimize their potential to coordinate any problematic behavior. For former legionnaires who attempt to return to civilian life rather than continuing military service, the challenges are even more severe. They possess skills that are primarily useful for violence, having been trained and experienced in combat, but lacking most civilian occupational capabilities. The psychological damage they carry makes normal social interactions difficult. Their combat stress responses manifest in ways that frighten or alienate civilians. Explosive anger at minor provocations, inability to tolerate crowds or loud noises, hypervigilance that makes simple social gatherings exhausting. Employment opportunities are limited, with many civilian positions requiring background checks that reveal their criminal records, even if officially pardoned, even when employment is found. Maintaining it proves difficult when trauma responses interfere with job performance, or when the mundane nature of civilian work feels meaningless compared to the intensity of combat. The legal status of pardoned former legionnaires creates additional complications. While their pardons theoretically restore full citizenship rights, the reality depends heavily on local authorities and their willingness to honor imperial pardons. Some planetary governments maintain their own blacklists of former criminals, treating imperial pardons as irrelevant to local law. Others implement restrictions on former legionnaires, prohibiting them from certain occupations, requiring regular check-ins with local arbits, or maintaining surveillance that amounts to continued punishment even after redemption. The variability of enforcement means that a former legionnaire pardoned on one world might find themselves arrested for old crimes on another, the pardon honored in some jurisdictions and ignored in others. This creates an environment of legal uncertainty, where redemption is always potentially revocable, always dependent on the whims of authorities who may or may not respect the documents that supposedly guarantee freedom. The children of former Penal legionnaires inherit their own form of stigma, even in cases where the parent has achieved full redemption and integration. The knowledge that one's parent served in a Penal legion, that they were condemned criminals who somehow survived, creates social complications in communities that value honor and moral purity. These children may face discrimination in education, employment, and social relationships, paying for sins they didn't commit through association with parents who did. Some former legionnaires respond by hiding their past entirely, never telling their children about their service, maintaining elaborate fictions about their backgrounds to protect their families from the stigma. Others embrace transparency, using their experiences to teach their children about redemption, survival, and the complexity of moral judgment in impossible situations. Neither approach fully shields the next generation from the consequences of Penal legion service, the past persisting in ways that resist erasure. The ultimate truth about integration and stigma is that redemption in the legal sense often doesn't translate to redemption in the social sense. A former Penal legionnaire might hold official documents declaring them pardoned and restored to full citizenship, might have served honorably in regular guard units after their Penal legion service ended, might have spent years proving themselves loyal and capable. None of it erases the scars around their neck or the faded tattoos on their skin. None of it changes the fact that they were once condemned criminals who were meant to die but didn't. For some, this stigma becomes motivation to prove themselves, to demonstrate through actions that they are more than their worst moments. For others, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, the constant prejudice and suspicion eventually driving them back into the behaviors that condemned them initially. And for a few, it becomes something to embrace, wearing their Penal Legion past as a badge of honor, proof that they survived what was designed to kill them and emerged stronger for it. The path from condemnation to redemption to integration is never straightforward, and the scars left by the journey mark those who walk it in ways that persist long after the explosive collars have been removed. THE statistics. When the Administratum compiles its endless records of imperial military operations, Penal legions appear as numerical abstractions, unit designations followed by strength assessments and casualty rates. These statistics tell a story of consumption and attrition. Thousands of condemned criminals fed into the war machine and converted into tactical advantages through their deaths. But the official numbers, like most imperial statistics, obscure as much as they reveal. They don't capture the full reality of Penal Legion service, or the truth about survivors who exist in numbers large enough to matter yet small enough to be conveniently overlooked. To understand the real statistics of Penal Legion survival requires looking past official records to the patterns that emerge when those records are examined critically. The baseline statistic that dominates all discussion of Penal Legions is the first, battle casualty rate. 70 to 90% of fresh Penal Legionnaires die in their initial engagement. This number appears consistently across different formations, different enemies, different tactical situations. It's presented as evidence that Penal Legion service is essentially death with extra steps, that accepting service over execution merely delays the inevitable by a few hours or days. And for the majority, this is accurate. They board the transport ships. They're driven forward into enemy fire, they die. Their names are recorded if there's time and administrative capacity, which there often isn't. Their bodies are left where they fell, or burned in mass cremations, or simply abandoned to the elements. The system worked as intended: criminal sentenced, service extracted, criminal dead, box checked, next batch please. But that 70 to 90% casualty rate means 30 to 10% survive the first battle. Given that Penal Legion formations often number in the thousands, even 10% survival represents hundreds of individuals. And those hundreds, having survived their initiation into combat, face significantly better odds in subsequent engagements. The second battle might see casualty rates of 50% among those who survived the first. The third battle, 40% among those who survived the second. The rates don't improve because battles get easier, but because the population being measured has been filtered through survival selection. Each battle removes the least capable, least lucky, or least adapted, leaving behind an increasingly resistant population. This creates a statistical pattern that should be obvious, but is often overlooked. Penal Legion units that have been in service for extended periods contain disproportionately high numbers of skilled veterans relative to their overall size. The famous example of the 13th Penal Legion illustrates this perfectly. Beginning with approximately 4,000 convicted criminals, the unit was reduced through combat to 250 effectives over roughly 2 years. Simple division suggests an attrition rate of roughly 94%, which sounds consistent with the narrative that Penal Legions are designed to consume their members. But those 250 survivors represented something extraordinary. Individuals who had each survived dozens of engagements that killed thousands of their comrades. They weren't average soldiers. They were the resistant strain, proven in the most brutal filtering process imaginable. Their capabilities likely exceeded those of elite formations from regular guard regiments. Yet officially they remained Penal Legionnaires, condemned criminals whose survival was almost embarrassing to a system designed to ensure their deaths. The statistical invisibility of long-term Penal Legion survivors stems, partially from how the Administratum categorizes and tracks military personnel. Transfers to regular guard units often result in records being scrubbed or sealed, with the individual's Penal Legion service buried in classified files that don't appear in standard personnel databases. Pardoned legionnaires who return to civilian life disappear from military statistics entirely. Their fates unknown and untracked, unless they commit new crimes that bring them back into Imperial custody. Even legionnaires who die during their service often aren't properly recorded, their deaths noted as part of overall unit casualty figures, but without individual identification. This creates a situation where the true number of Penal Legion survivors across the entire Imperium is essentially unknowable, hidden in statistical gaps and administrative oversights that the Administratum shows no interest in correcting. Specialized Penal Legion formations like the Savla Chem dogs present their own statistical complications. These units experience different casualty patterns than standard Penal Legions, partly because they're deployed in specific tactical situations that play to their strengths and partly because their motivation structure differs from fear-based compliance. Chem dog casualties might run 60% in their first battle rather than 70 or 90%, and subsequent attrition rates trend lower than standard formations. This creates larger populations of veterans who persist through multiple deployments. Some of these survivors eventually return to Savlar, passing on their experience to new recruits in ways that create institutional knowledge persistence that standard Penal Legions lack. The statistics don't capture this knowledge transfer, don't account for the fact that newer Chem dog formations benefit from training and insights provided by veterans who shouldn't exist according to the consumption model. The redemption statistics are even murkier than survival rates. How many Penal Legionnaires earn official pardons through extraordinary valor? The Administratum doesn't track this consistently across all formations and all time periods. Anecdotal evidence suggests it's rare, perhaps 1 in 10,000 Legionnaires ever receiving a pardon, but even that estimate is based on fragmentary data from specific units during specific campaigns. The actual rate could be higher or lower by orders of magnitude. How many are transferred to regular guard service through bureaucratic means that don't involve formal pardons? Unknown. How many simply disappear from records, their fates lost in the chaos of war or deliberately obscured by sympathetic officers? Unknown. How many die free after achieving redemption, and how many die still serving despite technically completing their sentences? Unknown, unknown, unknown. The gaps in the data are vast enough to hide populations that might number in the hundreds of thousands across the entire Imperium. Comparison statistics reveal the selective attention the Imperium pays to casualty rates. Regular guard regiments that experience 50% casualties in a single engagement are considered to have been brutalized, their losses deemed unsustainable and requiring immediate reinforcement or withdrawal. Penal Legions that experience 50% casualties are operating within expected parameters, with officers sometimes disappointed that more didn't die. This creates a perverse situation where Penal Legion survival rates, while objectively terrible by any rational standard, are actually better than might be expected given the tactical situations they're deployed into. The fact that any Penal Legionnaires survive their first battle, let alone persist through multiple battles, represents a deviation from the ideal, where all would die immediately after extraction of maximum utility. The Imperium doesn't celebrate this. It doesn't even really acknowledge it. The statistics exist, but they're not analyzed for what they reveal about human resilience and adaptation under impossible pressure. The psychological statistics, to the extent they exist at all, paint a grimmer picture than physical casualty rates. What percentage of Penal Legion survivors suffer from what modern medicine would diagnose as severe post-traumatic stress disorder? Probably close to 100%, though the Imperium doesn't have diagnostic frameworks for such conditions and wouldn't care if it did. What percentage develop substance dependencies from combat drug exposure? Unknown, but likely very high among formations that regularly employ chemical enhancement. What percentage successfully reintegrate into civilian life after redemption? Unknown. Though anecdotal evidence suggests the number is depressingly small. These statistics matter tremendously for understanding the true cost of Penal Legion service. But they don't appear in official reports because the administratum measures success in bodies spent and objectives achieved, not in the long-term welfare of survivors who were never supposed to exist. Regional variation in Penal Legion statistics suggests that institutional factors significantly impact survival rates beyond simple combat effectiveness. Units with commanders who view legionnaires as expendable cannon fodder to be spent immediately tend to have higher casualty rates than units with commanders who recognize that experienced legionnaires are valuable assets worth preserving. Units attached to campaigns led by competent generals tend to survive at higher rates than those attached to incompetent commanders who waste regular guard units as readily as Penal legions. Units deployed in specific tactical roles for which they're suited, urban combat, tunnel fighting, toxic environment operations, survive at higher rates than units simply thrown forward as human waves. These variations suggest that Penal Legion casualty rates are not fixed properties of the units themselves, but rather consequences of how they're employed. The statistics could look very different if Imperial doctrine treated Penal legionnaires as soldiers rather than as disposable munitions. But such doctrinal change would require acknowledging that their survival matters, which contradicts the fundamental purpose of Penal legions as mechanisms for killing criminals. The truth behind the statistics is that Penal Legion survivors exist in numbers large enough to constitute a significant population across the Imperium. Yet they remain statistically invisible through a combination of administrative oversight, deliberate obscuration, and the simple fact that the Imperium doesn't want to account for them. They represent a failure of the system to kill them as intended, a success in extracting more value than expected, or both simultaneously depending on perspective. Their existence challenges the narrative that Penal Legion service equals death, proving that survival is possible even in environments designed to prevent it. Yet this survival comes at costs that statistics can never fully capture. Psychological damage that persists for lifetimes, social stigma that marks them as permanently other, and the knowledge that they beat odds that killed thousands of their comrades through some combination of skill and luck that might not persist into the next battle. The numbers tell us that most die and some live. The truth is that both the dying and the living carry scars that the statistics never measure. That redemption through survival is possible, but never guaranteed. And that the Imperium's coldly efficient consumption of condemned criminals produces occasional survivors who are simultaneously proof of human resilience and evidence of how terribly that resilience must be tested before it matters to anyone who keeps the records. Kunz yu Siam, we've walked through the grim reality of Penal Legion existence, from the crimes that condemn to the psychological toll of survival, from the mathematics of attrition to the rare paths toward redemption. The truth about Penal Legion survivors is layered and complex, resisting simple narratives about either the Imperium's brutal efficiency or the indomitable human spirit. Both are true simultaneously. The system is designed to kill these condemned criminals, extracting final utility from lives deemed worthless. And yet some survive. Through skill or luck or stubborn refusal to die on schedule, emerging from the meat grinder as veterans who were never supposed to exist. These survivors challenge the fundamental assumptions of Penal Legion doctrine. If the purpose is to punish through death, then their survival represents a failure. If the purpose is to extract military utility from condemned criminals, then their survival represents extraordinary success. Individuals who have paid their debt in blood many times over. The Imperium's response to this contradiction is characteristic. It largely ignores it. Penal Legion survivors exist in bureaucratic grey areas. Their fates uncertain and their futures dependent on the whims of commanders who may view them as valuable assets or as persistent stains that should have been scrubbed away through death. Some earn redemption and freedom, proving that even in the Imperium's cruelest formations, exceptional service can occasionally be recognized and rewarded. Others continue to serve until luck runs out, veterans who survive dozens of battles only to die in the next. And a few find themselves cycling between redemption and recondemnation, unable to exist in normal society after what they've endured, drawn back to the violence that shaped them even when freedom beckons. The broader implications of Penal Legion survival extend beyond individual stories of redemption or tragedy. These survivors represent what might be the Imperium's most efficient creation of elite combat capability, if only the Imperium chose to recognize and systematize it. The same brutal filtering process that creates last chances capable of impossible missions could, if properly institutionalized, transform Penal Legion service from a punishment that wastes human potential into a crucible that forges exceptional capability. But this would require acknowledging that criminals can be redeemed, that survival matters, that the condemned deserve treatment, as soldiers rather than as expendable munitions. Such acknowledgement would fundamentally contradict the Imperium's approach to justice and military doctrine. So the current system persists, inefficient and cruel, occasionally producing extraordinary survivors almost by accident while consuming thousands who might have become valuable if given better equipment, training, or simple acknowledgement that their lives had worth. For those who survive Penal Legion service, whether through formal redemption, bureaucratic oversight, or simply outlasting their sentences, the scars remain. Physical scars around the neck where explosive collars bit into flesh. Psychological scars from accumulated trauma that will never fully heal. Social scars from stigma that follows them even into freedom. These scars mark them as fundamentally changed by their experiences, as individuals who have seen and done things that most humans never will, who have endured pressures that break most who face them. Some wear these scars with pride, as badges of survival and proof of capability. Others hide them in shame, trying to build normal lives while pretending their past never happened. Most fall somewhere between, acknowledging their history while trying to move beyond it, haunted by memories of dead comrades and battles that should have killed them but somehow didn't. The question of whether Penal Legion service achieves its stated purpose depends on how that purpose is defined. If redemption means the condemned person's soul is cleansed through violent death in the Emperor's service, then yes, the system works for the majority who die as intended. If redemption means transformation of criminals into productive Imperial citizens who have paid their debt and deserve second chances, then the system mostly fails, grinding up those it's meant to redeem and spitting out traumatized survivors who often can't successfully reintegrate. If the purpose is simply to extract maximum military utility from condemned prisoners, then the system is inefficient at best, treating valuable human resources as disposable when they could be leveraged more effectively. None of these purposes is served optimally by current Penal Legion doctrine. Yet the doctrine persists, because it fulfills the deeper purpose that may matter most to the Imperium. It provides visible, brutal punishment for transgression while simultaneously squeezing final use from the condemned. It's theater as much as justice, demonstration as much as redemption. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and human life is the cheapest currency, Penal Legion survivors represent something approaching hope. Not the comfortable hope of rescue or easy redemption, but the harder hope that survival is possible, even in impossible situations. That human beings can adapt to horrors that should break them, that some debts can be paid, and some sins can be forgiven even in the Imperium's unforgiving machinery. They prove that the system, despite its best efforts to consume them, cannot kill everyone it condemns. Some slip through, surviving when they shouldn't, persisting when they're meant to die, emerging from the crucible changed but unbroken. Their existence matters precisely because it's unexpected, because it represents individual resistance to collective machinery designed to ensure their deaths. If you've made it this far, I hope you've gained deeper understanding of what it means to survive as a Penal Legionnaire in the 41st millennium. These are stories the Imperium doesn't tell, lives that exist in the gaps between official statistics individuals who matter despite systems that insist they don't. Their survival is rare but real, costly but achievable, and it reveals truths about both human resilience and institutional cruelty that the Imperium would prefer remained hidden. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Penal Legion survivors, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the darkness of the far future, and your support helps make these videos possible. Thanks for watching, and remember, in the Imperium, even the condemned can sometimes find redemption, though the price they pay for it may haunt them forever.